there was a little politics going on because Giscard d'Estaing was fighting the mayor of Bordeaux, who was named Chaban-Delmas, who was a famous World War II resistance fighter and a very charismatic character. But we had this lovely meeting in the office of Pompidou, which the Élysée is a really beautiful place. The next day, Giscard d'Estaing, who had been opposed absolutely to our giving any money to Ford for new investments, was instructed to give money to Ford for its new investment and did. The next day, but noon, the motorcycle guy comes up and the letter all done. It was really amazing.
Hello and welcome to this very special 500th edition of the Minter Dialogue. I am Minter Dial and I'm your host for this podcast, a proud member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. For more information or to check out other shows on this lovely network, please go visit evergreenpodcasts.com. I'd also like to give a shout out and thanks for putting up a 5-star review to Mitgo I. Happy New Year. Well, this week's interview marks the 500th episode of the Minter Dialogue. Is a special one, and it's with a man called Victor Dial, yes, with a last name that is the same, and that would be because he is my father. My father had a long career in the automotive industry, rising to be chairman and general manager of Ford France, then VP of sales and marketing in Peugeot worldwide. Simultaneously, he was chairman and then CEO as well of the American Hospital of Paris. He was a board member for many companies and lived the majority of his adult life in Europe, between the UK, Belgium, France, Switzerland, and Spain. In 1988, he was awarded the Legion of Honor by the government of France. In this chat with my father, we discuss his life, his biggest influences and lessons learned, some of the incredible highlights of his career, his passion for flying and singing, and so much more. Hope you'll enjoy it. You'll find all the show notes on minterdial.com. And if you have a moment, please go over and drop in a rating and review. And please don't forget to subscribe to catch all the future episodes. And now for the show. Well, isn't this a special occasion? Here we are. I'm having a conversation with my father. Only this time, it's live. I'm recording our conversation. So, Papa, welcome to the Minter Dialogue. You named me. It was a great name. It has been a great name. And I want to, in this chat, introduce you to my listeners and get a whiff of the life that you have had, the most interesting life that you've had. So let's start with, where did you grow up, Papa? Start with the home front. And in 1938, 20th of June, you're born. Start with that.
In Long Beach, California, where my father was stationed in the U.S. Naval Base. And I spent the first 8 years or so of my life in Long Beach, California, waiting the war to end and then finally to move back to New York.
So your father, of course, and we've really worked this, and people who are listening will be encouraged to go check out The Lost String Home, the story about your father and mother. So you were brought up in Long Beach, California. Your father left when you were just a couple of years old, and you had this amazing grandmother. Tell us about her, because she was quite the influence on you.
Well, she was wonderful, and she had a big impact on my life because the first thing she did, or among the first things she did, was teach me how to read. And so by the time I reached 5 years old, I could read like a demon. I could read the newspaper. I could read anything. I could spell crazy words. And I vaguely remember, but I do remember winning a spelling bee when I spelled idiosyncrasy correctly at 5 years old. And I dare say most of your listeners would probably have trouble with that word. But I could do it at 5 with my eyes closed or however it was necessary. Sorry, the other thing about my grandmother, there's several other things that are interesting. One, we lived on the beach, and it was a very, very long beach, as you would suspect with a city name like that. And my grandmother and I were out one night walking on the shore, and it was a dark night. There was no moon, and there was gazillions of stars in the sky. And she at one point looked at me, and she said to me, "She said, Victor," she said, "do you know there are more stars in the sky than there are grains of sand on all of the beaches in all of the world?" And I thought, my goodness, that is a lot of sand, because I was 5 years old. I was very familiar with the sand and doing body surfing, and I getting sand all over me. And there was a lot of sand around, and I was quite amazed. I've never forgotten that. And I was sitting the other day with lunch with a great astrophysicist who lives here at my retirement home. And I said, told him what my grandmother told him. I said, "Do you think it's true?" And he paused a minute, and he said, "Your grandmother's right."
Wow.
That was my grandmother. She's a very smart lady. I told me one other thing, which has haunted me my entire life. She said, you should not eat cheese." And she said, "You should not eat cheese because cheese is made of rotten milk. And rotten milk is just not good for you. So don't eat cheese." So I have spent the next 80 years of my life obeying my grandmother, and I have never knowingly taken any cheese in my mouth. Knowingly. I probably have unknowingly.
And that despite living in a country where they're pretty famous for their cheese, that'd be France. And if it's not France,
Yes.
Switzerland, Belgium, and you've avoided cheese. What would you say to your grandmother today?
Well, I'd say that she's really in the minority. Not a lot of other people seem to know this thing about the rotten milk. The other thing she said was, by the way, had to do with chewing gum. She said chewing gum is made of old galoshes.
That's so fun. But if you had a chance to chat with her right now, what would you say to her? Having had all this reading, the galoshes, the cheese, the stars, what would you like to tell her?
Well, I would like to tell her I hope she's noticed that I have always listened to her.
Wise words.
She had a big impact on my life. I will never be able to thank her enough for helping me skip first grade.
So you're in California with your sister Diana, and then the war is continuing on. You find out that your father has died, and your mother Lisa is invited to go to New York, as I recall it, and ends up meeting Ken Hinks, to whom she gets married. And then you move, is that correct, to Connecticut?
That's right.
And where did you move in Connecticut? And what was life like there? You went to Groton eventually, but not right away, I guess.
We started off living, we spent a summer in New York City, which was infernal because it was very, very hot. And my parents determined we'd be better off living in a cooler part of the world, in Connecticut, where it was cooler along the beach and so forth. And so we then went in the fall to a little town near New Canaan, Connecticut, and I went to quite a good school at that place. They called St. Luke's School, where I met a number of classmates there and whom I'm still friendly with today, believe it or not.
And I know that you already had started playing tennis. Is that where you began playing tennis?
Yeah, that's right. I was 9 years old, and I didn't know how to play really much of anything because the school in California, I don't remember playing any sports at all. And so I started playing sports, and I was little because I was a year younger than my classmates. So I got bashed around a little bit in football, and I wasn't very strong in baseball, and I wasn't too good at athletics at that point, but I worked hard and I tried to improve. And by the time I left, I was a little bit better. Maybe not a world setter on fire, but a little bit better.
Certainly your tennis we'll talk about more. But now at this age, I'm wondering, well, thinking about you as a 9-year-old, you are surrounded by kids who have all gone through the experience of being kids while your country's at war. And I'm wondering what kind of reflections might have happened. I mean, it must have been so hard during the war for anybody to have any form of easy happiness, because you all knew about what was going on. Do you have any recollections or any feelings about what you as kids were feeling? Did you feel like, oh, that was just over there, very far from me? Or was it something that you all felt and somehow talked about, even if it was through jokes or references?
Well, I don't remember those kinds of discussions, but we were living in Long Beach, California, which is a big naval base. So, and we were living on the beach, and so you could see the boats anchored offshore going in and out. And so saw there was a lot of activity, and occasionally even there'd be a wreck that would sort of drift up onto the beach, a boat, an LST, that might have broken down. And I can remember playing on some of the wrecks and having fun doing that. But we were. And I was aware of things going on because my mother was an aircraft spotter, and she disappeared every afternoon or during the day, often during the week, to climb the tower on the nearby building and look for Japanese aircraft, which she never did manage to see. I don't think there were any. But that was our contact with the war, was sort of that. And I remember rationing of the car, so we had to be careful driving because we had ration cards and probably for food, but I remember the car, we had to be careful. And I don't remember having discussions with my classmates particularly. I think we were pretty insensitive to the thing because Long Beach, even though it was a base, was peaceful. And that's about all I had. The war seemed a very far off thing. I didn't quite understand it. I'm sorry not to have my father there, but I didn't really quite understand what was going on with him either. So
I'm sure of that. That makes total sense. But I'm now thinking of you as a 9-year-old in St. Luke's in Connecticut. You're a little bit more wiser, but you're still not, obviously, an adult of any sort. But you've got kids who might have also lost or had injured parents around. And was it ever a discussion in classes? Do you studied history or anything? Or was it again, you were sort of protected from discussions around the war?
I don't remember a lot of discussions about it in school or even at home very much, unless there's somebody who came by the house who might have been a friend of my father's at some point and might have wanted to keep contact. And of course, my mother occasionally talked about it in a very sad way when on occasion. But I basically don't remember more than that. And I was always a little wary with my mother because she could have sort of breakdowns when she talked about her first husband, and whom she never stopped loving. And it was obviously, even when we were young kids, 11, 12 years old, that my mother was seriously affected or shattered by the disappearance of her husband, whom she loved so dearly. My stepfather was a wonderful man, as you point out, a very gentle man, a very understanding man. He knew what was happening, and he never lost his calm demeanor and never lost his taking care of Lisa, who was his new. He was a man. Imagine that. He was 49 years old, a bachelor. And he suddenly finds himself marrying a woman with 2 children, 9 and 7, and now living in a family at that age. He's now 54, 55 years old, and discovering this new life. I imagine what a culture shock that must have been for him. I mean, it was bad enough for us, but he must have really, how he got through it, I don't know.
Well, and certainly he played a very important role in the Second World War as well.
Yes, he was an OSS, and he had a good career. He was commissioned a lieutenant commander in the Navy to give him rank necessary to carry out his functions. He was based primarily in London, and I remember him talking often about Bill Donovan, who was the founder of the OSS, and talking about him. And I remember after the war, I remember looking at charts that he had, papers that he had during the war. But he had a good war, and he was a nice man and well respected by those around him, including his children.
Well, I'm just thinking about how it was a real change for him. I mean, not only bachelor to married life with kids, not his, but also going from the war environment where it's kind of all hands on deck, long hours, real stress, to post-war life, working in an office, worrying about smaller things, and kids. And I of course I knew him and I loved him dearly. But I can only imagine that must have been a real shock, as you say, in terms of new lifestyle.
Absolutely. I think of it, even thinking of it now, I say it's miraculously that they stayed together, miraculously that he agreed to it to begin with and changed his life as radically as he did is wonderful. And he was a generous man. He was a kind man. He was a learned man. He brought a lot to the table.
Is it not true, speaking of tables, that one of the first meetings you had, you quizzed him at a dinner table? I have this image of you saying, "Grandpère," or I don't know how you called him, "Ken, do you know how to spell?" And there's some kind of funny word that you asked him.
Oh, you mean idiosyncrasy?
Yeah.
I don't remember that.
Well, you did tell me that story, that you grilled him. He said, "Well, do you know how to spell idiosyncrasy?" At some young age, and I assume with his charming little giggle, he would have answered.
He was Phi Beta Kappa. He went to the University of Minnesota, and he was Phi Beta Kappa, so he was no dummy. He was in the top 10% of his class, and he's commissioned an officer in the First World War. He got a direct commission as an officer, so he was no dummy, and he knew, but he didn't show off as much as I did.
It's normal at that age. So you're at St. Luke's. You start. You're 1 year younger than everyone else, your classmates, and you're beginning to play some sports. And then, as I understand it, you go to Groton.
That's right.
And tell me about Groton.
Oh, that was a legendary school in those days. It was founded by Reverend Endicott Peabody, who was a giant of a man. He was a priest. Episcopalian priest, but when I went there, he'd left, but he was succeeded by John Crocker, who was a very strong, very decisive, sort of hard headmaster. And it was a school that attracted some very high achievers. The famous graduate that they were all proud of was Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
Heard of him.
There was one of the first graduates, and then more recent period, for example, Dean Acheson graduated from there, and there were the Alsop brothers who were famous journalists, and there were some very high achievers in this. It was a small class. We were only 35 in my class, where there were only 200 in the whole school. It was really a very small school, but it had a big reputation, and it was a lot was demanded of you. You had to work pretty hard. But I was aided in that because I love to read, and reading was a big part of my life. I read everything, and we would get a semester assignment of a number of books, 10 books or some number we had to read, and I would get all the books right away, and I'd start reading them, and generally in the first week I had read all the books. And I was also a very fast reader. Not only was I a good reader, I was very quick. Didn't remember everything perhaps I read, but I get through them very quickly, and by the first week or two I would have finished the entire semester's assignment of reading. And then I don't know what, I probably read comic books after that. I don't remember very well, but I hope I read something more serious. But it was a tough school, but I was very ambitious and enjoyed it. I really enjoyed reading. I've always enjoyed reading.
So do you feel that your grandmother actually taught you to speed read as well? Or is that something you did by yourself?
whatever she taught me worked pretty well. I think I really credit her with everything from a reading point of view, an educational point of view. She was a terrific teacher. She had her own school. She was very ambitious. She was the daughter of a Methodist priest in Michigan, and she went to the school and was elected the prettiest schoolmarm, and for which she got a silk umbrella as a prize. And anyway, she went on to teach school, and then in California turned her house. She had a big house on the beach, the same house I was talking about a little while ago. She turned it into a girls' school. I don't know how many girls there were, but I must have enjoyed it because there were plenty of girls around. And so she was definitely an educational plus for me. I mean, really wonderful.
So that was Mrs. Porter's school that she started, not to be mixed up with Miss Porter's school in Farmington.
That's right.
Because she, of course, was a porter. At least her father was. The minister was a porter, right?
Her father was a minister. No, he's not a porter. I think Bogardus was her father's name. She was a descendant of one of the first settlers of Manhattan Island. They were Dutch, and she one of the first priests, the second priest of the colony, named Everardus Bogardus, and so she was a real Yankee. I mean, she was an original Yankee, and
right, a Yankee living in California. So, going back to Groton, you're reading all these books. You talked about ambition. Where do you think you got your ambition from, this ambitiousness to get ahead?
I didn't. I wasn't thinking about getting ahead in those days. I was just thinking about doing my assignment, enjoying the reading. I enjoyed the stories. The stories were fascinating. I mean, I loved Huck Finn and things like that, and I loved more serious books as I got older. And no, I really loved reading, and I was fascinated by what I was reading, and I was happy to get good grades as well. But I was really thinking more about the pleasure I was getting out of the stories.
I can imagine you as a little boy somehow at this point, kind of like a SWAT, as we say in England, and a kind of know-it-all because you read so many books, whereas I, in my youth, far from a devourer of books, always trying to make up for things I didn't know, whereas you probably did know.
Well, you did well, Mentor. So I'm very proud of you, and nothing to complain about in for your record of school and life. It's a wonderful life.
I've tried my bit. So, Groton, I know that I'm pretty sure you say you have some friends who've also come from your Groton days. Is that correct?
Absolutely. I had my three compadres. Groton was a tough place. The other students were very smart. And I remember I was a year younger. I don't know to what extent I remembered that or lived with that, but I certainly, looking back on it, realized how it was something of a difficulty. It was a little hill to climb because these guys were a year more experienced than me. When you're 12 years old, a year can make a big difference. It doesn't make any difference when you're 84. But it sure did make a difference when I was 12 or when I was 16. When I was 15, all the boys were 16 and they were getting their driver's license or this and that, and they had 18 and I was 17, and maturity and so on. So I felt like I was always struggling a bit, and I was wasn't quite as big as I wanted to be. And that came sort of later. Now I'm a little bigger than I need to be, but never mind. It's all right. And I, for once, am glad to have had my extra year now that I look at them back and say, I'm going to barely live to be the oldest graduate in my class, as coming from the youngest. We'll see how that goes. I don't know.
That's right.
I made several really close friends whom I'm still in touch with today, and Woody Ives, Thatcher Adams. They're wonderful kids, and some of them, funnily enough, I ran into Yale, of course. I followed at Yale, and one was I had a nemesis who was from Chicago and Lake Forest, and he was my nemesis. He was very witty and sharp and sarcastic and quite mean. And only after we got to know each other again through the alumni, through reunions and so on, and where we had to write stuff about, we were asked to write stuff about our lives, and I started writing some stuff about my life. And this nemesis his name was Dick, would suddenly said, you were the best writer in the class. He said, and you're probably one of the best writers I've been familiar with. And he was a major in English, and I was quite astonished that he would make such a compliment to me, because he was really mean to me during the years that I was at Groton. And all of a sudden, he turned out to be my biggest booster. And at the age of 80, imagine that. And it was something. And he would tell everybody, you got to read this guy. He's a really wonderful writer. And he got me made a sort of honorary member. The Yale class had a writing group in it composed of some very famous writers of the Time magazine or Life or newspapers, the New York Times, and there was some very high-powered writers in it, and they studied writing at Yale, whereas I didn't. I was studying history and French mostly, but I became an honorary member of this writing group, and I've had great fun with these guys, most of whom I didn't know at Yale because they were busy printing out papers and magazines. And then we later became friends, led by my nemesis at Groton. That's why I was bringing it up. And he died recently, I'm sorry to say. But redemption was the word I would use with him.
Well, the expression that comes to my mind are swings and roundabouts. Youngest to longest, not good to good. There's some sort of way that the world works its way out. So you're coming to your last year in Groton, and you have to choose university. Tell us how it was like in the early 1950s, choosing a university and the selection process, and how many backups did you have? What was that like?
Well, this is probably a delicate subject, because it's even today they're discussing, admissions policy and who should be admitted and who shouldn't be, and what should the process be. And in some ways, I don't know, I don't want to say embarrassed, but this is the way it was for me. Well, I remember we had a college advisor, and one of the professors at Groton was assigned to help us through the process, and we were only 35, so it wasn't too difficult, but. I remember going into him, and he says, "Where do you want to go?" And I said, "Well, I don't know where I could get in." He said, "Well, where do you want to go?" And I said, "I don't know. And maybe thinking Harvard or Yale, but I don't know if I could get in there, or maybe back up. I'd go to University of Virginia. That I'd heard about that. I didn't know much about anything." And apart from Harvard and Yale, and Groton was pretty close to Harvard, but and also most of the people in the class went to Harvard. Class before me, there were 35 in the class, and I think 30 went to Harvard, and I think 5 went to Yale, and that was it. So they said, "There's no sense wasting time. Just tell us where you want to go, and we'll take care of the rest." And there you go. I applied for Yale. I got in, and I even got advanced standing. And I was not only a year younger, I got advanced standing in history and French. And so my freshman year at Yale, I only had to take 3 classes. The other 2 classes or I could have taken sophomore classes, which I was too busy having fun to imagine doing that. So I got a great education at Groton. I was able to get into a really great university. It's going through some problems right now, however, in my opinion, and a number of my classmates, but never mind. Still a great university, and it was a different process then as it is. So look at it today.
So you chose Yale, 4-letter word by some people's minds these days. I mean, as I did, of course. Yeah, indeed, I got 2 of them. But what do you think of that choice? You could have gone to Harvard, right? I assume it would have been as easy. Did you find yourself in a minority? Do you have any recollection as to how you decided on Yale versus Harvard?
Absolutely, absolutely. First of all, our class was a bit of a rebellion for some reason. As I mentioned, the year before, the 30 went to Harvard. In our year, there were 30 some odd, and we who went to either Harvard or Yale, but it was 50-50. It was 15 to Yale, 15 to Harvard. Because we sort of we wanted to be near New York. New York was where the action was. Boston was considered a very uninteresting town, probably wrongly, but a very uninteresting place. The bright lights, and it was my absolute desire to be near New York, because New York, they go back for Thanksgiving or go back for parties in New York City, and I thought New York was a pretty glamorous place, and I didn't think the same about Boston. So I just wanted to be near New York. That's all. And a lot of my classmates, it was the same deal. We wanted to be near New York. Didn't want to be near Boston. It was too boring.
All right. So you land in New Haven, Connecticut, and you spend 4 years. Your first year, you obviously didn't have an enormous amount of workload. You enjoyed having fun. Tell us about how you got into flying.
Well, it was a girl I was chasing, and she I chased a lot of girls in those days. It was hard to catch them. They were fast runners, and but I had a girl at New Year's Eve, and I wanted to date her, and she was in Cape Cod, and I somehow couldn't get there. And I had a dear friend at Yale who was a pilot, and I enticed him to fly me up there so I could be with her for that New Year's Eve and my senior year. And unfortunately, the weather turned bad, and he was unable to make the flight up there, and I had to cancel out the girl. I was heartbroken, but he said, well, listen, while you're here, we can take a flight. Would you like to go in a little airplane? And I said, oh, well, I've never done that. And of course, I was prepared to do it to dating the girl. I wasn't sure I wanted to do it just for fun. And so we took this rickety old plane with no heater, and they couldn't even close the windows very tightly. And it was cold. It was in January, New Year's Eve. And it was very, really cold, and we tandem. It was front and back, and it was very rudimentary. But I fell in love with it. I absolutely felt this is for me. So as much as I could, I learned to fly in the winter of '59, and we had to take a blanket and gloves, and had gear and protected. It was so cold. And you climb up to 5,000 feet, it's even colder. And during the winter, it was just cold. And anyway, and then I graduated to a plane that had a heater. That was real luxury, having a heater. And I loved it. And I built up some hours. And I used to fly to LaGuardia Airport in New York City in the evening, do touch and goes at LaGuardia Airport, which was the airport. There was no Kennedy,
JFK or Newark.
Idlewild was what we called it. It was even just a little strip. The big airport was LaGuardia, and there I was doing touch and goes. I look back on that, and I think that was an amazing thing, how flying has evolved. And I've loved flying all my life. I don't fly anymore, but I've loved it.
If you think about all the flights you've commanded, what flight comes to memory as the biggest memory you have of flying?
Oh,
there's so many, right?
So every flight for me was a pure, unadulterated pleasure. There is a moment of when you're taking off from a field, and I get this is one of the ways, the tricks I use to go to sleep even now today. I think about a flight. I'm getting in the plane. It's pouring with rain, and wherever I am, and everyone's grounded. No, we can't go anywhere. And I get in my plane, and I have an instrument rating, which I worked hard to get. And I get in the plane, and I start it up, and I crank it up, and I'm talking to the control tower and getting my IFR clearance, and then taking off and flying into a cloud. Taking off, you can't see where you're going, and then at some point you reach the top of the clouds, and that's 3,000, 4,000, 10,000 feet. You don't know. And all of a sudden you break out, and vast blue sky all around, and below there the clouds, and it's an amazing feeling when you transition from that really bad weather, storm, whatnot, into the blue sky. It's an amazing feeling, and I still have it today.
It's another world.
Wonderful, wonderful. I probably should have been a pilot. I tried certain things to get. I tried to become a dealer of Piper aircraft in Geneva, and I couldn't do it, and it required too much money. I didn't have it at that point, so I didn't. But I've always been fascinated by flying, and I've ridden a lot about flying.
Well, we're going to try to find a way for people to catch up with some of your writings at the end. So we've talked a fair amount about your upbringing, Pa, and the enjoyments you had of flying and not so much studying. You also had a lot of singing in your life. Tell us about the types of singing and groups you joined, and what kind of role it had in your life.
Well, someone asked me the other day if I had ever done any singing, and I answered very quickly, well, I've been singing all my life, and I feel like that's true. And the first thing that I remember is a recording for the radio in 1945, I think it was, and I recorded a solo to be sung by a soprano, a boy soprano. I was 8 years old, and the song was called Jesu, Joy of Man's Desiring, and I could still sing it if my voice were better. And I started with that. It was recorded and played on the radio in Long Beach, California, and maybe all over California, who knows. And that was my first professional appearance.
And it was recorded in a studio and then played on a vinyl, or you actually recorded it in the radio?
I think it was live. I think it was live, but I'm not sure. But I remember listening to it on a record that somebody made. Maybe it was the record, I don't know. But that was my first public appearance. And then when I went away to boarding school, I sang in the choir. I sang in the glee club, if there was one, and loved it, and absolutely loved it. And I did that through boarding school. And at one point, we were all single-sex schools in those days. But one day we had a concert with another neighboring school for girls, and they had a choir, and we sang together for a requiem.
Oh, and nice.
It's a beautiful piece of music and a lovely, lovely. First time I'd ever sung with a female group of sopranos and altos, and it was a wonder, and an orchestra, by the way. So it was a wonderful thing, and I just loved it even more. So when I got to Yale, again, the first thing I did was join the freshman glee club. And then I got taken up in a singing group called the Yale Alley Cats, which is an a cappella singing group with 12 members, and roughly spanning 4 years of college. So I started as a freshman and I finished up as a senior. And unfortunately, a big disappointment was my voice was probably not good enough, and perhaps my personality wasn't well enough developed to become a whiff and poof, which was, of course, the summum at Yale in singing. But I did pretty well, and I was in the Yale Glee Club, which was a marvelous voices, really much better than mine. But mine was okay, but it wasn't a star quality. We had lots of fun as a member of a singing group because we made trips together. We did an annual trip down to spring to Florida, which was a major event, and we drove down the eastern coast of Florida, staying often with Yale graduates who would hire us to sing for them and their alumni group in their area, or at a hotel. I remember singing at the Boca Raton Hotel. And we sang as many others, but I don't remember. And my role in that by that time was the business manager of the group. So I handled some of the bookings and the money and all that kind of stuff. And it was a big help for me in my life and a pleasure. And then I went to work Didn't do too much singing. I went to many, many concerts. But then over the years, about 20 years ago, someone had the bright idea of starting an alumni chorus because there were plenty of people, ancient former singers at Yale, who loved singing and were looking for outlets. Many of them sang in their local choirs or local singing groups, if there were any. But the Yale Alumni Chorus was composed of some very good singers. And that meant traveling, and that meant having an orchestra. And we made some wonderful trips and sang some wonderful songs. That's what stands out are places like singing at the Teatro Colón in Buenos Aires, which was a famous opera house, which was built in 1906, I think, the turn of the century. Famous for its acoustics and famous for its wonderful music that came out of there. I never would have sung anywhere near Argentina had it not been for that. We sang in Rio de Janeiro, of course, and in Sao Paulo. We sang at the St. Paul's Cathedral in London with the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra, 3,000 people, at an event commemorating 300 years of Yale since Yale's founding. That was a superb. We sang in Russia. In those days, that was possible to do, and we sang at the Mariinsky Theater in St. Petersburg, and under Valery Gergiev, who was still today one of the great conductors in the world. And we sang some wonderful music, some old music, but also some newer music, and with excellent singers. And we were all dressed in our white tie and very elegant. We were a big group, and it was wonderful fun.
So for someone who's not a singer, I mean, I am, and I love it. And I was wondering how you would describe that feeling of singing with other singers, the finding of harmonies and the feeling of everybody together in a chorus. What are the types of feelings that provokes in you?
Well, yes, it was a solidarity with our fellow singers. Some of the music was pretty difficult, and we weren't. This is about 20 years ago, as far as I was concerned. But I remember at that point, the oldest member of the group when I was saying was 83, which happens to be my age right now, and the youngest was 23. So you had these 60 years of difference experience, and melding them together was interesting, and the personalities. And I met some very nice people. One of the guys I met was able to help you with your film that you did.
No doubt, Josh Sheloff.
Exactly. So there were some good people along on the trip, and we talked music, we talked life, we talked Yale, we talked our business, we talked everything. But there's a special bond about singers, and there's a thing also that you realize is that when things are difficult. I happened to be in New York when the planes ran into the tower. And that evening, I was having dinner with a dear friend of mine in New York, and I walked through the streets of New York, which were absolutely empty. There was not one thing. And we would walk down the center of Park Avenue. Nothing was moving. New York was shut down. And I remember walking by and getting to a red light for which, for some reason, people were stopped. And there were no cars, but they were stopped there. And they were singing. They were singing the national anthem or the battle hymn of the Republic. And they were doing it for comfort because I think many were afraid there was more to come. Nobody knew. So in times of difficulty, singing is a way of bringing together and giving people courage. And then a month after the event, I had flown back to London as soon as I could get back in order to get to work. But someone organized a concert at the Lincoln Center in New York City, and I'd obviously never sung in the Lincoln Center. And plus, it was a concert for the benefit of the survivors. And I flew back from London to New York for the trip, for the singing. And I remember singing with an orchestra that had somehow been put together. It wasn't the New York Philharmonic, but it's a good orchestra. The Battle Hymn of the Republic, which is a famous war sort of inspirational film or song, or rather. to give everyone courage facing the conflict and possible death. And so the singing is psychologically also, in addition to being pretty to listen to, it's also very important spiritually.
Well, I talk a lot about music in my life, and I reference a book that I particularly like by a classically trained, I think it's a violin player, Daniel Levitin. And his book is called This Is Your Brain on Music. And it's remarkable what music does in the brain. So that's lovely. So you graduate from Yale, having had a fair amount of fun. You've got
Yes.
you got a pilot's license. Now what?
Well, I was in ROTC at Yale, so I had to decide if I was going to get. I didn't want to get drafted. Vietnam was coming up, and risks of a conflict in Lebanon and whatnot. So I graduated. I decided that I would rather be an officer than drafted as an enlisted man. So I did 2 years of service in the Navy as a Lieutenant JG, and from 1959 just until for 2 years. And I did not perform miracles during the war. I did my job and tried to be a good sailor. I had shore duty, and I had some interesting assignments. But I was glad I wasn't really determined to have a professional life. You might say, why not? My father did. I don't remember why. I wasn't more affected by that, but I was just thinking I wanted to go into business, and I wanted to go into international business. So the Navy was sort of a good way, perhaps, through that.
Did you ever serve on a ship?
I did as a midshipman. We had a summer cruise, and we had the 6-week or 7-week cruise, and in my job as a naval officer, I had to board ships frequently, but I never was assigned on the ship.
So you're looking for an international job. You're in the Navy. How does the job in Ford Motor Company come around? I gather that's the first job.
That's right. Ford was about one of the only companies. I remember seeing a few companies. My stepfather was a very well-known and respected member of the advertising world, and he worked for the world's largest advertising company at that time, which is called J. Walter Thompson, and they had offices all over the world, and they were just big number one. And they had the blue ribbon list of clients, and one of them was Ford. And I don't quite remember how it came up, but Ford was one of the companies that I applied to. And Henry Ford II, who was this grandson of the founder, had been at Yale for a year or so, and then had to leave to go and run Ford Motor Company during the war. So he never finished at Yale. And I don't remember exactly how I ended up at Ford, but they had a program that appealed to me because they were looking to form a cadre of young graduates who could succeed in the company and help with an international outlook. And Ford was a very outward-looking company, much more so than General Motors at that point. And as a matter of fact, I think even bigger than General Motors outside of the United States. General Motors was far bigger in the United States, but outside, I think it was Ford. Anyway, they offered me a career path that appealed to me at the time. And they made me an offer, which is not particularly attractive financially, but it was enough to get started. And then I managed to take advantage of opportunities when they came along, and I have a lot of help from people who wanted to help me. And that's how I started out with Ford and enjoyed 20 years working with them.
So my little monkey brain says, oh, another 4-letter word. Funny how that goes. The choices one makes. So for Detroit, I assume, is where you had to sort of do your initialization within the company,
That's right.
right? You get a choice where you can go, or at least they proposed to, as I recall, Brazil. What was the Brazil-Belgium story?
Well, Brazil came up because of a summer vacation the year before from Yale. I had somehow gotten it in my head that Brazil and South America was a very exotic countries and much more unknown and sort of mysterious than France or England or Germany, where a lot of people were going. And I went to spend a summer. I think it was about 6 weeks in Brazil and in Argentina. And there I remember being hosted by the presidents of J. Walter Thompson, thanks to Ken and his network of friends, and staying with these people in their big houses in Rio de Janeiro and Buenos Aires, and falling in love with every Brazilian girl I ever met, and helping them to learn how to dance. And then at the last minute, ending up in Belgium instead of Brazil. They both began with B, but that was about this point of similarity ended. And so the Brazil was, thank God for that. Thank God I didn't get sent to Brazil or didn't press it enough more. And I think I was beginning to have second thoughts at the point, and I'd married your mother. And we made the right decision by moving to Brussels and Europe. Latin America, they said about Brazil, is one of the future great countries of the world and always will be. And that's pretty well sums up Brazil.
So Belgium, you're now manifesting your French language skills that you studiously learned at Groton, a little less, presumably at Yale. Tell us how that was so this must be around 1963. You arrive in Brussels, something like that?
In 63, yes, that's right. In January of 1963. And it was a foggy day, and we ended up at the Grand Place of Brussels, which is about one of the most beautiful places in the world. And got stuck in and picked up a couple of mentors at work who I still love.
You're in Brussels. You've got this new job. You find some mentors. Tell us how you get mentors, because I feel like in my life, I've never really sought out a mentor. I've never really put a label on people as mentors. And yet, now looking back, I can think of people who were remarkably important in helping me.
Yes, I feel the same. I didn't know they were my mentor. All I knew was that I admired them, and I wanted to be like them. And I was enthralled. I had my biggest mentor was a fellow named Leo Beebe, and Leo Beebe had a very colorful life and was an early friend of Henry Ford in the Navy, World War II. He was Henry Ford's boss in whatever unit he was assigned to in Detroit. And so they knew each other, and Henry Ford had a tremendous admiration for Leo, and Leo was a problem solver. And he just worked harder than anybody else. And I can remember sitting in his office. He smoked cigars. A lot of the Ford guys did for some reason. I didn't. But he'd be sitting inside smoking a cigar and typing. He loved to type. So did I, by the way. I loved to type. And he would type out the minutes of a meeting that he just chaired. And normally you'd expect some sort of a subordinate to do that, but he did it himself. And he would almost before the meeting was finished, he'd be handing out his notes. But this is what you're going to do now. He was a demon for work, and I just wanted to be like him, and I watched how he did it, and I followed him around. I used to sit with him alone in his office not getting paid overtime or just sitting and talking and watching him. And he's mentioned, by the way, prominently in the film that Ford versus Ferrari that has been published, was launched recently, showed recently, and which portrayed him in a very poor light. And I was very upset to read that. And with some other friends, we protested and wrote letters to the producers saying that the film was inaccurate and unfair to the role that Leo Beebe played in it. And it's a long story. I won't go into that, but he was my hero. And he stayed friends. We stayed friends even after he had retired and even after I had left Ford. And one of his last letters that I have, and has come back to reading it after, it was in 1978. And he said, Victor, after a long letter, and he said, Victor, you have always impressed me by your great writing skills. And he says, I trust you are using them right up to the last minute. And if you I assume you have published a book, and if you haven't published a book, why not? And this is a guy who, I had worked for 20 years before, but he was still giving me orders. And I willingly accepted them because I just loved the man, and he was a super fellow.
Well, amen to that.
And he promoted me. I mean, you tell Henry Ford, he'd tell, I've got this great guy over here working for me. And he was just not shy about boosting the careers of his. I think I was the number one boostee, but I really liked him. And your mother, by the way, liked him enormously. And he was originally from Philadelphia area. And so we kept in close touch, and he was a great help to my life.
That was lovely. Well, my mum, of course, from Philadelphia area, for those who won't know that listening. So I wanted to just dig in on 1 second on this idea of friends, because this notion of friends at work, how do you sort of square that principle, the idea of being friends at work, when especially at that time he was your boss? But what is your view at the age of 84, looking back at friendships at work? How do you negotiate that?
Well, that's funny that you asked me that. I had another friend, a second mentor, maybe not quite as powerful as Leo, but still a very strong man named Dick Holmes. Because I got promoted in due course, and I was named Business Development Director for Ford of Europe in London. And my boss there was the Vice President of Finance for Ford of Europe, and his name was Dick Holmes. And Dick was a bigger than life character. He's physically very big, and he's tall, and he had 8 children. And he was a businessman, and he knew how to read a balance sheet back and forth. And these were mysteries that I hadn't really solved. And he helped me understand how accounting worked, and he helped me understand how you strategically position yourself competitively versus your competitors, and so on, and evaluate stocks. I mean, he was a finance guy, but he is a very human guy, and we became very close friends. And I even took him to Marbella on vacation, because I knew a lot of people in Marbella, and he was sort of anxious to sort of see that part of the world, and which I could help him. And then he'd help me by tutoring me on business matters, and we worked together. He was my boss. We worked together on some very interesting assignments, and notably getting the Spanish government to pass a law specifically for Ford, without mentioning Ford, so that we could make a big investment of over $1 billion, which this is in 1972. $1 billion in 1972 was a lot of money. Now it's just pocket change for a couple of these guys, but it was, in those days, it was the biggest investment ever made by Ford anywhere. And it was being made in Spain, proposed to be made in Spain, where there was a dictator who was on his last days, called Franco. And everyone was afraid that when Franco left, that Spain would devolve into sort of a revolutionary, bloodletting. And so there was a lot of fear that this investment, and we decided to put it in Valencia, in that area would be a disaster, and launch a small car. Ford had never made a small car and made money with it. So here we were pouring a bit. It was the biggest program ever by Ford, and the U.S. guys were championing the bit because they had programs they were pushing. And but Henry Ford was a big believer in Europe, and he was familiar with Europe and liked Europe, and so he was pushing. He was behind this plan, and my job was with Dick to negotiate the change in the law with some brilliant Spanish lawyers that we had, and negotiate change of law, get it passed through the legal process, and such as it was in Spain. And I helped write my writing skills. Here we go again. To the board of directors, you had to make a proposition to make this investment in Spain, and it was an important paper to write, and difficult because you had to overcome all the obstacles and the objections. And I was sort of the point man on writing this, and the chairman at that time of Ford of Europe was named Philip Caldwell, who was a Harvard Business School graduate, tough as nails, very critical, very tough guy, no fun at all, but a very competent man. And we did 34 copies for 34 drafts of the board paper. And the board, those were the days there was no automatic. They had carbon copies. You didn't have computers and all that stuff. We had carbon copies, and we had an army of secretaries who were revising the paper. Dick just threw up his hands. Dick finally said to Philip Caldwell, he says, "I give up, Philip. I can't do any better than this." And Philip says, "Well, then we'll ask Victor. He'll do it." so that's how I got a name with Philip Caldwell, and I had some very interesting stories with him. He was chairman of the company for quite a while. He died a couple of years ago, but he was a tough, very uninteresting person, but very smart. And but Dick was a great pleasure for me, and we stayed friends until the very end. And he was we were personal friends as well as business friends. And sometimes in offices they try to stay away from those things because maybe
That's right.
lose your objectivity about valuation. And he definitely he thought I was a pretty good fellow, and I definitely thought he was. But he's the one who got me promoted and appointed head of President of Ford France, because he said that was the best job for me. For me, in my experience, that would be the best experience I could have. And so he pushed me and pushed my name, and fortunately didn't have to push too hard because I did have some other friends, and I'd spent some time with Henry Ford in various occasions, and those are always special. So I was pleased to be appointed president of Ford France in 1974, 73.
And the experience of doing the factory or the location in Valencia, you're doing this while you're in Belgium, or is that when you're in France?
Well, at that point, I had moved from Belgium to Paris in 1967, and then I worked in 3 years in Ford France at that point, and then I went to London. And to work in business development with Dick in 1970, and did that until 1974, and that's when I was appointed president of Ford France.
Right. So you were working out of business development in London, and of course that's when I start going to school. I did want to circle back on an event before you moved to London, which is the birth of my sister. And I've had this story from my mother. I've had it from another person in the car, Nancy. I would love for you to describe the birth of my sister, Mr. Carman, working at Ford.
Well, that's obviously a major event, a major event. And of course, there's a lot of exaggeration. You build around the story, but I'm the only person who tells it truly. And
Of course. You can set the record straight now.
it was wonderful. I've written something, probably one of the best things I've written about the birth of Lisa. So I've rehearsed it carefully. It was a complete surprise, obviously, and the thing that is scary for a man, maybe not for a woman, but is you think that the only way to have a baby is clinical perfection. You want a clean room, and everyone's just standing there, and the doctor's there, and the nurses are there, and everyone's there helping and making sure it passes. But here's we're just in the car, in the front seat of the car. It was a Ford. Fortunately, it was quite a big Ford, but still, it was the bucket seat in France, and I was convinced that there was impossible that a baby born in those circumstances was doomed.
Because you were having a dinner party.
Yeah.
My mother's water breaks, and she corrals Charlie and Nancy, who have had kids, in the back seat. Oh, tell me more.
No, Charlie. It was Leaks, and I was driving. Leaks is in the front seat next to me, your mother. And in the back seat behind your mother was seated Nancy. Charlie he's claiming that he was in the car is completely false.
Record cleaned.
I love Charlie. He's a super guy, and he died a few years ago. He's a super nice guy. But he was not in the car. His wife, however, was in the car. And sometimes when I recount the story, I forget to mention that she was in the car. I try to pretend that I was doing all of the work myself. But in fact, there wasn't much work to do. The baby came out. There's nothing going to stop that baby from being born. And it was perfect event. And they've been perfect events like these have been happening for millions and millions of years as the human race has developed. But you tend to think of ours as the first one ever to occur like that.
Well, they're not so frequent in cars en route to the hospital.
Yeah, I was scared. I was scared to death. I was petrified. And I thought, I'm going to screw it up. I'm going to get lost. Because I didn't know very well it was a clinic. It was a clinic. It wasn't a hospital even. It was just a clinic. And it was a long weekend. So there were a 3-day holiday, and this is a Friday. And so Friday was closed, and Saturday, Sunday, Monday are closed. And so it's a long weekend, nobody around, including at the clinic, because when we finally get to the clinic after surviving the 20-minute drive from the house, the door is slow to answer, and it turns out that the young girl, who was even less experienced than I was, it was her first night on duty, and here I'm delivering, and she didn't believe me when I said the baby was already there. So I had to grab her and to pull her down to the car and show her that look, the baby's already here. She was telling me everything's going to be all right. Calm down. No. So she looked at that and said, "Oh my God, it's a baby!" And I thought, yes, she was as surprised as I was. And so it was a fun event, but it was scary at the time. And as I recount it now, I've had so much fun recounting it, and of course embellishing it usually as I was doing all the delivering. And but the fact of the matter is, your mother delivered her daughter by herself, and she caught the baby on the way out in her hands between her legs, and caught and held her to her body and nursed her, or started nurture to held her anyway, while I drove the rest of the way, 10 or 12 minutes. But not before I had probably destroyed the life of an elderly couple who were living on misfortune of living by the road. And we were taking through the woods, who I burst in on, wearing no shirt, because I'd take the shirt off to use for wrapping Lisa and to keep her out of the cold. And so I burst into this family's house with no shirt. But I still had a tie on because I'd ripped the shirt off. And so crazed, and I read in there the only thing I could think of. I said, what am I going to do when I break in? What am I going to do? And then I remembered that I should save and I get a knife so I could cut the umbilical cord. Well, I asked for a knife or demanded a knife. I mean, this little old lady who's living in the house and comes back, sort of waddling back, and hands me the knife, and I grab it. I run out to the car, which is sort of about 50 yards maybe away, run out, and with a knife and waving the knife. And your mother and Nancy and Lisa says, what are you doing with that knife? And I said, well, I'm not sure actually, but I thought we might use it to cut the cord. And she said, we don't need to do that. Get in the car and drive the rest of the way. Don't drop the knife. So I didn't want to cut the cord anyway, so I dropped the knife.
I wonder how that old lady kept on telling the story about that, you know?
We looked for her. A couple of days later, when things had calmed down a bit, Leeks and I drove around and tried to find the spot. But it had been at night, and we never did find the spot where she was born. And I had a bottle of Dom Perignon champagne, and I wanted to give it to her as a gift, and I never did find it. So finally, Leeks and I drank it a couple of days later, and I never did able to thank that woman.
Mm.
She I was scared her to death, but it was fun.
Yeah, send out some nice warm vibes to her and her family anyway. Right, so you have lived in France, the birth of my sister, in the car. You moved to London. You do the negotiation of Valencia with Philip Caldwell, and then, as I remember, you actually resign from Ford, or somehow there's some sort of kerfuffle about what happens next before you move to France.
Well, as I mentioned, I was really close to Dick Holmes, who was my boss at Ford. And he had gotten a proposition to run a medium-sized supplier to Ford, and who was interested in developing and opening and developing its European business. And Dick would be the man in charge. And Dick said, I got to have you alongside me if I do this. So we got to do it together. And so I said, well, this is my opportunity, because Dick was a real entrepreneur, and he unfortunately didn't live long enough to realize his dreams, but he was a big influence on me, and I was willing to follow him where it led. And so he said, I'll hire you. But he says, I can't hire you. This was happening in the beginning of 74. I think it was in March or April. And he said, but I can't hire you until the 1st of September. And so I said, well, that's all right. I can just do something until then. I'll find something to do. I'll go now. I'll retire. I'll resign now from the business development thing and leave Ford and come with you. And so he said, all right. So that, as far as I was concerned, that was a done deal. I wrote a letter to Ford, and I said, I'm resigning as of the 1st of whatever it was, April or March, April, May, I'm not sure. And then say goodbye to everybody. And then I buggered off with your mother, and we went on a 3-month holiday and went down to Spain, to Marbella, where we were happy, where we often went, many friends. And but I noticed that my paycheck kept coming in every month. And I thought, well, they were pretty slow in getting around to cutting my. Said they're going to come back at me and they wanted the money back. And anyway, they kept doing it for 3 months. They kept paying me, and I'd say to Dick, who is. He was getting ready to leave for his new job. They're still paying me, and he says, "Yeah, they're still paying you because they want you to stay. They've been calling me and trying to find where you are." I was getting calls from them, and I wasn't returning them while I was driving down to Spain. And so he said, "But please, they've threatened to cut off my bonus and to cancel all my stock options when I leave if I don't produce you, so that they can talk to you." I was very flattered by that. And I said, well, I just don't know. I wanted to go with you, and that's what I wanted to do. And he said, no, 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 you really ought to do this. You ought to think about it. So I did. And I said, all right, I'll do that as a favor to you. He asked me as a favor to him to do it. And so I called, and they said, please come in. The chairman wants to see you. The chairman of Ford of Europe wants to see you. His name is Bill Burke. He's a terrific guy. And so I did. I flew to London. I interrupted my Spanish holiday and flew to London. And they said, we want you to stay with the company. We want to offer you the presidency of Ford Spain. Because you've been negotiating that Spanish thing, you know all about Spain, and so on and so forth, and building the factory. And so I said, well, but I wanted to go with my friend, and we agreed to do that. And there's really no business here in Spain. And right now, business will be in 3 years when the plant opens. And there's going to be 3 years of building the plant, and that's not my specialty. And anyway, make a long story short, Bill Burke was a very good salesman. And he said, well, where else could we go? Do you want to go somewhere else? And I said, well, the only place I would really be natural would be France, because I do speak French and I've been living in France, and so on and so forth. Yeah, I said, how about that? And I said, yeah, but there's somebody in the job. Don't worry about that. If you want to go to France, you can go to France. And so I go back and I huddle with Dick, and Dick says, Victor, being a president of those big Ford subsidiaries is a wonderful job. You should take it, get the experience, and then when you've absorbed all that, you can come and work for me. The job will always be there for you. Don't do it. So that's sort of how I, in the end, withdrew my resignation. I never reimbursed them the 3 months, though, that I didn't work. I had a 3-month paid holiday in Marbella. I'm sure no one ever has had a 3-month paid holiday. And,
even in Europe.
Yeah, that's right, where they're known for their long vacations. Anyway, that was a story of that. And of course, I never looked back. And so it was fun. It was a great job. And one of the aspects of the job was negotiating the Valencia, not the Valencia, negotiating the Bordeaux.
So now you're in France. You're the president of Ford France, and you're negotiating the whole factory or the plant in Bordeaux.
Second factory in Bordeaux, and it was a difficult thing to get approval, and they were hesitating in Hemden Hall, and we were getting towards the end of the year, and finally we said the thing to do is to go and see Pompidou, go to the president. We get this thing done. And so Henry Ford. That was the thing about Ford. I mean, Henry Ford, he could see anybody he wanted to. He probably even could have seen the Pope, but I mean, he wanted to see Pompidou and wanted to see him. And so Bill Burke, the man I mentioned, who was the chairman of Ford Europe, Henry Ford, and I went to the Élysée Palace. It was in December, and we had an hour-long meeting with Pompidou and the two of his staff members who we'd been dealing with and negotiating back and forth. And there was a little politics going on because Giscard d'Estaing was fighting the mayor of Bordeaux, who was named Chabot-Delmas, who was a famous World War II resistance fighter and a very charismatic character. And there were a lot of French politics involved here. And but we had this lovely meeting in the office of Pompidou, which the Élysée is a really beautiful place. And we had an hour-long meeting, and the next day, Giscard d'Estaing, who'd been opposed absolutely to our giving any money to Ford for new investments, was instructed to give money to Ford for its new investment, and did. The next day, but noon, the motorcycle guy comes up and the letter all done. It was really amazing. And then, but there was some chemistry there, and Henry Ford seemed to like Pompidou, and Pompidou seemed to like him, and politics probably involved, but nevertheless, it was a nice meeting. And then a couple of months later, Pompidou died. He had cancer, and he had cancer when we met. He was meeting with us, and it was he wasn't doing much business in those days. And anyway, he died in April of the 74, and we Henry Ford called me up and he said, I'd like to go to the funeral because I like Pompidou, and I think it'd be a nice thing on our part if we do. So will you arrange it? Which I was able to do, and so he flew over, and we went to the funeral at Notre Dame.
Did you just before you had to presumably call up someone at the Élysée and say, listen, I need an invitation, how many people for? It must have been some kind of exchanges in order to do that. You can't just sort of show up.
That's right. That's right. Well, that's right. And so I had this brilliant PR guy working for me. I didn't know much about PR in those days. I'd just only taken over the job in France for a few months. And so my brilliant PR guy goes, and he comes back and he proudly says, I have 2 tickets for you and Mr. Ford. And I said, because Mr. Ford, before he came, I always call him Mr. Ford. You know, everybody in the company calls him Mr. Ford. Nobody called him Henry. And although B.A.B. told me that Henry Ford had many times said to me, to B.O.B.B., would please call me Henry. And he said, he said I could never do it. I had too much respect for that man. Anyway, so Mr. Ford asked me what clothes, what's the dress? And so I called the PR guy and I say, what's the dress? And the guy says, the dress is dark suits. So I called Henry Ford back and I say that he's in Detroit, and he said the dress code is dark suits. And Henry Ford says, "You sure? Because that doesn't sound right to me." St. Louis, we're from a big cathedral, and all the world leaders from all over the world, and we're just in dark suits. Doesn't sound right. I said, well, I'll check again just to make sure. So I called my PR guy and I said, you're sure? Because Henry Ford thinks it's not. No. He says, I know. He looked very impatient. Why you keep asking me this? Can't you see that I know everything? He was very conceited, this guy. And so I called him back and said, no, it's dark suits. Okay, all right. So I agreed to meet him then a couple of days later for Saturday morning, or it was Sunday. The service is Sunday. Anyway, so that weekend, my wife had invited somebody for the weekend to stay with us. I think it was Butchie Honeywell. And after dinner, during the day, the motorcycle policemen, they had these amazing delivery service for messages from the president. And they came with a motorcycle guy, and he comes to the door and delivers the tickets. They're very elaborate and very, very formal. And I had been meeting him at the airport, so I hadn't seen the tickets, and they were so Leaks puts them on the mantelpiece of our living room, and I sort of had forgotten them. And when I got back home, they were sort of already there, and so we were having dinner and then coffee after dinner, and then I tell everybody how important I am because I had to go to the next day to the funeral, and I would probably be the only one with Henry Ford at the funeral, and Notre Dame would be empty except for us. And so they said, the Butchie Honeywell says, well, let's see, you got the tickets. Let's see the invitation. I said, well, I haven't looked at it. And so the first time I opened the envelope and I saw the invitation, and then I handed it to Butchie, and he says, I hope you have your jacket. I said, jacket? What's the jacket? He said, well, that's a morning suit. I said, oh, morning suit? What's about a morning suit? The dress is dark suits. He said, no, it's not. It says jacket. And I said, grab the invitation. And I look on the invitation, and there it is, jacket. I said, oh, my God, what is
Mortified.
This? Mortified. And 3 times we'd had this conversation with Henry Ford, and I'm such a nitwit that I can't even know what to address it. And he's going to fly all the way from Detroit he had one, of course, he had one at home, and he says, I can always bring it. And I said, no, there's no need, because it's only dark suits. And so I was at wit's end, and I said, this is it. This is my first big moment to show how smart I am and clever and all, and I blew it. And I said, they're going to fire me on the spot, and we're going to have all the television cameras from all over the world broadcasting this, and the only two people they're going to see that are going to be out of order are me and Henry Ford as we walk in, filmed, wearing suits and showing no respect for the president of France and all the rest of it. And I thought, this is just the end for me. I just starting out, and I was my first big chance, and I blew it.
And for context, this is Saturday evening.
Oh yeah,
in Paris, and in the 1970s, businesses are not open.
National mourning. So there are 3 days of solid holiday: Saturday, Sunday, Monday, solid holidays. Everything is closed. Everything is closed. So I said, what can I do? And I said, I could break into some store, maybe I could break in. Anyway, I went to bed that night wondering what I said, maybe inspiration will come. And I woke up at 5 o'clock in the morning. I had gone to sleep sort of about a little earlier, and I said, all right, I'm going to find a store, and one way or another, I'm going to get that store open. So I got the yellow pages out, and I opened it, and I'm looking up stores for costume rentals, and I find there's one with the big first page, a whole page taken up. And so I said, that's where I'm going to go. I'm going to break in. I'm going to come back. I'm going to come out of there with 2 suits, one for him and one for me. And so I opened the book, and there's this full page, and I saw the address, and not far away. And I said, before, I'm just going to call anyway, just to see what happens. So it's 5:30 now in the morning, and I call at 5:30, and the first ring, it answers. First ring. I said, well, now I'm safe, because there's somebody there I'm going to be able to grab, and I'll be able to bribe him or steal it. We can hit him over the head and steal whatever. So I said, yes, I want to. He said, oh, you come right over. I said, yeah. Oh, really? He said, yeah, we've been open since 5. The store is full. We've been open since 5. I jump in the car, roll over there, and there it is, a store, and there are lines of cars in front. Not quite, but there are a lot of cars in front. And we go in the store, and there's a lot of people getting fitted for morning suits. And a lot of the African presidents who'd flown in the night before and didn't have them, probably any in their country, the president of Cote d'Ivoire. Anyway, so the guys are all busy trying on the coats, and I rented 3, well, I actually rented 4. I rented 3 costumes. One was the size of Henry Ford that I thought he was. And then I did another one, which I thought was a little bit bigger. And I got another one, which I thought was a little bit smaller. So I had 3 for him. One would be right. I thought the middle one would be right. And of course, one for me. So I went over to the hotel. They stayed at the plaza and rang. It was a little early. We were supposed to meet at 9:30 or 10, and it was 9 o'clock. And he was up, and he'd been. So I said, just got here a little early in case there was any problem. And he said, anything? No, I said, everything's normal. I said, and here's your jacket. Here's your jacket. He said, jacket? And I said, well, there's a last minute change of plans, but I solved it, and here's your jacket. And it was the right size for him, fortunately. And he never asked me about the 2 other empty boxes, the 2 other boxes that I took out when I left. They came with 3. I was wearing one, of course. And finally, so we had this service, and it was very nice. And as we were driving back, he's flying back to Detroit after the service. And the service ended. We got back into the car. We got back onto the autoroute, driving out to the airport. And I said to myself, I wonder how I'm going to get the pants back from.
You have a deposit on them.
Yeah, the jacket, trousers, the coat was all right. I'm going to get the pants. And so we stopped the car on the edge of on the shoulder of the autoroute. And I get out, and he uses the back seat, and he changes the pants. We got out and went into his suitcase and came back with a set of pants, and we got in the back seat in the car and put them on. And that was that. And he wrote me a nice letter and really very thanking me for the arrangements and realizing that I'd gone through a long and sleepy. Because I told him when it happened finally that I couldn't. I thought I was feeling pretty relaxed, and it happened. It all sort of sorted out. So I sort of told him the story, what happened to me. And he laughed. He laughed when they thought of all the people changing clothes at 5 a.m. So that was Pompidou. But we also knew Giscard d'Estaing. I knew him quite well, and he liked to shoot, and he shot with my brother-in-law, and so I saw quite a lot of his successor.
So you have this remarkable experience with Henry Ford, Mr. Ford, to everybody else. Do you start calling him Henry afterwards?
No, nobody calls him Henry. Maybe his wife does, but nobody in the company ever called him anything but Mr. Ford.
So there's a little stop off about me I'd like you to share, which, because you end up just selecting for me to go to Eton, another 4-letter word, a theme in our chat. I would love for you to tell me and everybody else how and why you decided to send me to Eton. I was at boarding school in Dorset at the time, at the old Malthouse.
Well, your mother and I had considered that it was better to have you in following one school system than to go to a French school and an English school and then a German school. It was better to have him in a school system that he follows right through. So once we decided on England, and the old Malthouse is a great success, and you were very popular, and you made a great success of your experience there, for which I'm very proud of you. How you'd handle that. It was not easy going away at a young age, and I'm sure. And but having to do with the second choice, with what after that? How do you do after that? There's only one choice if you live in England. Eton. There is no other school. But Eton is difficult because my friends were telling me that Eton is a good school, but the important thing about Eton is in being in the correct house. So there are 23 or 24 house masters, houses where the students are living, and each of the house master. And if you have a good house master, you can be a much better experience for you than if you have a bad one. I would ask the boys at school on these shoots, and I had a couple of families that I got to know pretty well, and they knew how things worked, and you got to get him into, there's a house, and the name kept coming up. His name is Peak as the housemaster, and he said Peak is considered to be really one of the 3 or 4 best houses, and that's the one you ought to try to put him into. And I said, or mentor into. So I went to see Peak. I've forgotten quite how I got an introduction to him, but I went to see him, and I thought that the sight of my imposing presence would be sufficient to convince him to find a place for you. And he was a very nice man. He said, listen, I'm really very sorry, and your son sounds terrific, but I have no room. I only have so many beds, and as much as I'd like it, what happens around here is when somebody is born, they put them down for birth, and from birth, and there is no it's not that I wouldn't like to have him, but there's just no bed for him. And I said, well, that's really bad news, because your house is always mentioned when I inquire about Eden. Yours is always mentioned as the number one place to be, and that's the place that I want my son, and I'm sure he wants to be too. And the other thing I knew, and he said, well, it's just really sad. And I said, yes, well, but the other thing I knew about Peak was that he was a great sportsman, and what counted for him, he was his house being the best house and winning various Etonian English sports, the ball game or this, whatever they call them.
Field game.
And so if that's what mattered to him, he didn't care so much about your grades as about how well you played the sports at Eton. And that's an exaggeration, of course. But I said, well, that's too bad because Minter's a really good athlete. He loves to play cricket and he loves to play football. And of course, he's very good at all those things. And he said, oh, that's interesting. And I don't know what happened, but I left there and he said, well, I'll see what I can do. I can't offer you any help, hope really. And then that was my personal involvement. To my amazement, several days later, he'd found a place for you. And I don't really know how it happened, but I did have a couple of powerful friends, none of them being Humphrey Swire, who was my great friend, and his son was at Eton, and I think